blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, just think about how would you behave towards Potiphar if you were sold into slavery, if you were betrayed, if you were beaten, if you were put in chains. For some reason, the Lord makes everything that Joseph touches prosper. Everything. So much so that an Egyptian man who does not worship the God of Joseph can see this and be like, okay, something's going on with this kid. So, Potiphar had to be a reasonably intelligent man. He's the captain of the guard. He had to be intelligent. He's powerful. He has all of this stuff. It's not like some gullible smug. But even he seen something in Joseph. He's like, man, something is going on with this kid. I'm gonna test him. And he keeps, Joseph probably started out doing menial tasks, mopping the floor, doing terrible things that nobody wanted to do in that house. He was the newest slave. But somehow, he just rises. Man, God just blesses him. And the text just gives God all the credit in this. The Lord was with him. The Lord favored him. The Lord gave prosper. All of this stuff. But he blesses Potiphar's household for the sake of Joseph for some reason. And this is going back to what God promised to Abraham a long time ago in the book of Genesis, that through your descendants, all nations will be blessed. The problem so far has been Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, more often than not, they've brought curse upon the nations that they've interacted with. They've caused trouble for the nations they've interacted with. They've deceived the nations. They've done all this stuff. But here you have Joseph, who through deception ends up a slave, and now God is fulfilling that promise through him to bless people outside of that family. And you've seen this kind of before where Laban was blessed just because of Jacob's presence. You start seeing this thing going on in the Bible just because of the favor of the Lord. Other people are being blessed. And so he continues. Oh, wait, before we move on, I want to point out a theme that gets overlooked all the time in this story, and it's the theme of power. Joseph had lost all of his power, was stripped of it, but somehow accumulated all of that power, well, a lot of power, in the house of Potiphar. And how does he use that power? He's in charge of everything that Potiphar owns. Potiphar's not even paying attention. He's just worried about what he's going to eat that night because Joseph is running the show at this point. How would you use that power? Would you use it to get revenge? Would you use it to orchestrate your escape? Joseph seems to use that to bless everyone around him. And there's a saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so with this newfound power, there's this sense that how is he going to continue to use this power? And that becomes a contrast to what you're about to read. Is this going to corrupt him? Is this power going to affect his morality? How is it going to work? He's already withstood adversity. He's been through a ton of adversity. Now he has a little bit of prosperity. Even though he's still a slave, he's the number 2 guy. Now, Joseph's about to be tested. It says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. Okay, so in this scripture, we learn that Joseph is a hottie. But seriously, like if you're ever having a debate, who's the hottest guy in the Bible? My money's on Joseph. This is the only time that it says anything like this about a guy. It says he's well-built and handsome, like good to look at. The only other time someone is described this way is, interesting enough, his mom, Rachel, who Jacob was madly in love with at the sight of her and worked 14 years to try to earn her hand in marriage. So, yeah, I don't know. There were smoke shows. I don't know what's going on here. But unfortunately, Potiphar's wife takes notice of this. And she propositions Joseph in just a incredibly blunt way. Like all the commentaries I read and the rabbis talking about this say this is one of the most offensive, like wild things this woman could have said. And it's a command. It's not a question. It's not like she is using her power. Remember, we're talking about the theme of power. She is using her power to try to command Joseph to sleep with her. This is Potiphar's wife. She's treating Joseph not like a human being, but like a slave, like he is an object for her pleasure, nothing more. And she commands him. But, think about this. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes. Think about all the terrible things that have happened to Joseph. How would you respond to this? You've been betrayed, you've been exiled, you're a slave. Now someone more powerful than you, the wife of your master, has propositioned you. Everybody wants to feel wanted. Everybody wants to feel desired. And I think he might have had to have that thought, like, man, what has acting right ever got me in life? What is doing the right thing done for me so far? Maybe I just do this. What's the point of trying to live righteously? But for some reason, I think we're stuck here. There we go. But he refused. He says, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? So he's been severely tested here, but not only does he not do this, but the reasons he gives are, man, my master has given me all of this. Why would I do the one thing I'm not supposed to do? And it reminds me of the Adam and Eve story. So much of the book of Genesis, just replaying. What did God do with Adam and Eve? You can have everything. Go, be fruitful, multiply, enjoy the good creation. There's one thing you can't do. Don't eat of this tree. Don't. And what did they do? They ate of the tree. And you see this story over and over again in the Bible. But here, for some reason, Joseph has everything, but he doesn't fail that test. He doesn't fail that test out of honor not only to Potiphar, but more importantly to God. He says, man, I'm not going to do this wicked thing. This is a sin before God. Remember, Joseph lives way before the Ten Commandments. How does he know that this is a wicked thing before God? Somehow, in the midst of all of this, Joseph has an intense understanding of what is right in the eyes of God. Even though God has never spoken to him in this story. God doesn't speak. He's seemingly silent through all of Joseph's struggles. But Joseph doesn't cross this line here. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't even entertain it. It's no hard. I think for most of us, if something like this were to happen, we would maybe not do it, but we would play into it. We would like the attention. We would like the way it makes us feel. Yeah, it's fine to be flirty. It's fine to hang out. It's no big deal. He's like, absolutely not. And then he sets boundaries around this thing. In a world where God is silent, seemingly Joseph sees God's hand in everything. Even though God hasn't spoken to Joseph, even though there's no explicit instance of God giving Joseph some sort of instruction or anything in this time, Joseph somehow sees the hand of God in this whole situation. And he's mindful of it and honoring of God despite how horrible his circumstances have become. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. He sets boundaries and says she spoke to Joseph day after day. Most commentaries and the rabbis say this went on at least a year of every day. This lady trying to make this happen with Joseph. She was just burning with desire for Joseph for whatever reason. But he sets boundaries, and he's like, man, I'm not even going to be around her. So he does everything he can to not even be in her presence. And we see this same sort of situation pop up in other places in the Bible. Think Samson and Delilah. Samson starts off strong, but Delilah just keeps doing it. And eventually Samson's just like, okay, let's do this. And he does it twice. But Joseph is like, no, I'm not going to do this. And so she conspires. She comes up with a little deception, a little plan. She gets all the guys out of the house. She gets all the other servants out. He says one day he went into the house to attend his duties, just doing his job, and none of the household servants were inside. So she caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me again. So her manipulation hasn't worked, so now she tries force. She's just violent about this. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Like, she's just being relentless. That caught there is an act of violence in the Hebrew. Her verbal attempts failed, so out of desperation and frustration, she results to physical aggression. And here's the deal, like, he flees, he runs, and notice that she steals his cloak. Remember in the previous chapter last week, what did they take off him? His cloak, his coat of many colors. They ripped it off him, then they used it in deception to deceive his father. And the same thing is going to happen here. He flees without it. She's left with this cloak in her hands. And out of embarrassment and humiliation or anger, need for revenge, she goes, okay, I'm going to come up with a story to get this guy. And so he doesn't even try to defend himself or explain. He just flees. And when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called the other servants. So here's what she comes up with. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew, she's never called him by his name. Look, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and he ran out of the house. She immediately accuses Joseph of doing the very thing that she was trying to do, first off. And once again, this coat is going to be used in this deception. And look at the language she used. This is a master class in manipulation. She calls the other slaves in and she says, look, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. And that most Bible translations, the NIV, your Bible might have something else. This Hebrew has been brought to us. She's accusing Potiphar of orchestrating this. It's like he brought this Hebrew here to make sport of us. Not only is she lying about Joseph, she's putting the blame at Potiphar's feet, first off, that he did this like Adam and Eve. No, the woman gave it to me. No, the serpent did. She puts the blame on Potiphar. She says this Hebrew marks him as an outsider, this immigrant, this person from outside. He's the problem. He's the danger to us. Man, he's a danger. He's here to mess with us, to make fun of us. He's a danger to our culture. He's a danger to us. She's trying to get the slaves on her side, like they're on the same level, like they're equals and they're buddies. And she's trying to turn the other slaves against Joseph. Let's go. Check my notes here before I continue. I'm trying to be careful about what I say because she does a lot of nonsense here. And with her putting the blame on Potiphar, it's a contrast between Joseph. Joseph, the slave, honors Potiphar. My master has given me all this. I won't sleep with you out of honor. And his wife, who's his wife, is placing the blame. She doesn't honor Potiphar in this. And while Joseph has been a slave this entire time, he acts like the one with authority and freedom. She acts like a slave to her passions and her desire for Joseph, which is the story I didn't want to talk about earlier. It's a good contrast between Judah and Joseph here, what he's doing. Yeah, so she mixes in a little racism. This Hebrew says she kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. So immediately accusing Potiphar of orchestrating this. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Now notice it doesn't say it who. This is very interesting. It seems like, as this story continues, Potiphar does not believe his wife. Now, the reason I say that is because the punishment for this would be death. He is a slave in this house. They would execute him on the spot for something like this. But Potiphar, for some reason, escorts him personally to prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So there's some ambiguity in this, where most of the commentators and the rabbis say, man, we don't know. Maybe she had a history of this. Maybe he was aware of this, and he had to punish Joseph without humiliating his wife publicly. He had to do something. Apparently, this was a scandal, so he has to do something for Joseph. So he gets him off as leniently as he can, personally takes him to the king's prison where the political prisoners are held. So it's like not Guantanamo Bay, kind of like a white collar kind of situation here. And so he kind of tries to smooth this situation over. Like, Potiphar is not an idiot. He has to have some indication that she's lying about this. But anyways, we'll move on from there. He can't dismiss his wife's testimony without publicly humiliating her and himself. So the action he takes against Joseph is as minimal as it can be to still retain his family's honor. And so why this is important, think of Pontius Pilate with Jesus. Joseph, of course, which we'll talk about probably next week, is an archetype for Jesus. And remember, Pontius Pilate set up to judge Jesus, and he's like, man, this guy's innocent. But he has to maintain order. He feels like his hands are tied. And while he places his political and career ambitions over the righteousness of Jesus and allows Jesus to be taken and crucified, here Potiphar sends Joseph to prison. And Joseph, for some reason in all this, it's interesting, never defends himself. There's no account of Joseph arguing about this. It's just neat. So now we see Joseph cast into prison. So he went from favored son, wealthy, beloved, betrayed, exiled in a land that he doesn't know, sold into slavery, put in chains, to being a slave in Potiphar's house, rising to power in that place, having now all of that stripped away from him. And now he's lower than he was as a slave. Now he's in prison. In Psalms, I think 105 talks about how much the shackles hurt his feet, how much the chain around his neck hurt his neck. So again, think about this. What does it mean for the Lord to be with you? This is a tough story. He's done the right thing. Every moment, other than maybe being too braggadocious about his dreams when he was young, maybe he's just young and naive. In all of this story, he has behaved with the utmost righteousness. And what has it got him? Suffering. Pain. Suffering. Rejection. This story is tough. But look at the next verse. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. This is like a perfect bookend. This chapter starts with this, and this chapter ends with this. So no matter what Joseph's circumstances look like, no matter what his life situation is, it just makes clear the Lord is with him. The Lord is with him. Whatever Joseph does, God makes succeed. So think about this. What does it mean for the Lord to be with us? What do we learn from this story? For one, I think we need to notice that God does not remove Joseph from suffering. He doesn't. It will be years before God provides a way out of this. Years. Joseph spends almost 20 years in slavery and prison. 20 years. That is a long time to wait, to be out of suffering. But in the meantime, I think the thing to learn about this is God is not uncaring. We have this idea that for God to be with us, we would be wealthy and successful and we'll have no trouble in this life and things will be going great for us. And that when that doesn't happen for us in a season, that God is uncaring, that he doesn't exist, that he's not with us. But this story says, no, your circumstances are not tied to your relationship with God. Your relationship with God can be unchanging despite all circumstances. In the meantime, in those circumstances, God is not uncaring, so much so that God doesn't just sit back and let us suffer in this life. I think that phrase, God with us, is telling. God was with him. Because ultimately, we know where this story goes. And we know that Joseph is an archetype of Jesus. And what does Jesus do? What is his biggest thing? The purpose is there. He enters into our suffering with us. That God, far from like being removed from us and in some lofty place that we can't reach, looking down on our suffering, comes into our suffering. Does it with us and for us, experiences suffering on a level that none of us can fathom. Not only was Jesus betrayed by those closest to him and sold, not only was he rejected by all those people, but he endured the cross, which is one of the most inhumane ways humanity has come up with to kill a person. Through suffering, through the 40 lashes, through being beaten, through being spit on by the crowds and mocked with a crown of thorns jammed onto his head with a robe, a coat. Remember Joseph's coat? A coat put over him and mocked the king of the Jews. And then to be crucified with criminals like he was a common criminal. God steps into our story. And so when we're in these places of suffering, that phrase, the Lord was with him, stands true of us. Far from being disconnected from our sufferings, those are the times where God is closest to us, where he is in it with us. That's what he demonstrates on the cross. And as the ministry team comes up, I want to invite you. Amber reminded me, I always intend to end service with communion. And a lot of people didn't know we even have communion or do it corporately. We have the communion elements here. But as the ministry team comes up, I want to invite you to think about this story. Think about your suffering. Think about your traumas. Think about those things where it feels like God is not listening and God is distant. And understand that in the times where God seems to be the most silent, can be the times where he is working the most for us and in us. And if you feel like Joseph today, if you feel like you're alone, if you feel like you're in a sort of prison, if you feel like you're suffering, maybe even suffering unjustly, that you have behaved righteously and that God owes you for something, understand and know that God is not oblivious. He sees you, he knows you, and he's with you in it. God knows very well the suffering and evil in this world. And the message of Jesus on the cross is that someday, that through his suffering, through his life, his death, and his resurrection life, death and suffering and pain, trauma, none of that gets the last word. That through faith in him, through clinging to him and his righteousness, that righteousness counts for you. And that ultimately he will do away with all of this. And that's the hope of the Christian faith. That's the hope that Joseph had seemingly millennia before. That he knew that God could be trusted. And so if you need prayer, I want to encourage you to come get prayer or to take the communion and just think about what communion means. His body broken for us. His blood shed for us. That the resurrected life of Jesus is for us through his suffering. That he paid the price. That he atoned for our sin and the sin of the world. That his blood covers us. That through his stripes we are healed. Not just physically, but totally healed. So if you need prayer, I want to encourage you to come get prayer. Father God, we say we love you. And we thank you for your loving kindness. God, we thank you that even when we don't see it, you're working. We're thankful that you are faithful to do what you say you will do. We're thankful that no matter what people intend for evil, no matter what anyone intends for evil, Father, you are faithful to work it out for good. That in the long run, all the wrongs will be made right, every tear will be wiped away, everything that is lost will be regained, Father. Father, thank you for your goodness. Amen. Y'all have a good week.